So today what we're going to do is build a guiding coalition to really drive change, and I want us to think differently and to really think about how we drive new outcomes. So what we're going to do today is really start with what is today's reality. You know, we went from regional supply chains to global supply chains, and in the process of doing this, we've got 90% of the supply chain stuck at the intersection of cost and inventory. And if you ask any supply chain leader what's job one, it's cost, but we haven't made a lot of progress here. And I do a lot of writing around what I call the effective frontier, and this morning we published a report where we were looking at what are the metrics that really drive market capitalization and the effective frontier. People talk about value and they want to drive value, and I say to them, how do you define value? And they look at me like I'm the craziest analyst in the world. But we don't have a clear definition of value, and we've been on a journey for cost. So as we think about this, we've got to really think at the intersection of the metrics of growth, of cost, of inventory, and return on invested capital. And most supply chains are not really designed to help build the engine of growth. I was talking to a manufacturer the other day, and I said, you know, how are you aligning your supply chain to grow? And she said, is that our role as supply chain leaders to really drive growth? And so as we think about supply chain 2030, we've really got to build supply chains that can test and learn and drive growth, because growth has the highest correlation to market capitalization. And also, this thing is a non-linear complex system, and what we've tried to do is manage the supply chain linearly in predictive analytics. And as we become more global, the non-linear nature of the supply chain has to be modeled, and we move from predictive analytics to cognitive analytics to really be able to look at how do we deal with streaming data and unstructured data to really drive supply chains differently. Now, this is from the research that we published, and this was a fun study. We took 1,400 companies, 5 years of quantitative research, and we asked the question, what can we learn from the last decade? What can we look forward to? And what we did was we said, based upon companies and company performance, because I don't think that we're true to hold ourselves accountable for balance sheet performance. What happens is people will implement projects, or they'll implement a technology, and they'll give themselves a pat on the back and they'll say, we did great things with that project. But my question is, did that translate to the balance sheet? When I wrote my first book, I printed the balance sheets for 600 companies I'd worked with as an analyst, and I put the balance sheet information into 3 piles. Those that had made progress on both inventory and cost, those that had made progress on one but not the other, and those that have made progress on neither. And most companies are not making progress on either. So in this analysis, we took Hadoop, and thanks to the folks in the room from Cloudera for giving us the technology to do this work, and we ask ourselves the question, what can we learn by combining the 5 years of quantitative results with balance sheet results to really answer the question of how have technologies helped? So the first thing we learned is those that have clarity of inventory targets, and you would think if you had clear inventory targets that you'd be able to better manage inventory turns and you'd be able to really manage cost. But what we find is that's not true. And in fact, we find an inverse relationship, and one of the issues is I don't think we understand inventory very well. We've been focused on safety stock, not really the form and function of inventory. And as the supply chain has become more global, we have more in-transit stock, and we're not good at managing cycle stock in the manufacturing environment. Secondly, I tested 65 different factors. How were supply chains organized? Did they have a common ERP? Which ERP system did they have? Which consultant did they use? And of those 65 factors, the number one thing that drove cost improvement is satisfaction of the supply chain team. Now that was surprising to me because I thought it would be alignment, I thought it would be visibility, but satisfaction of the supply chain team, the ability of the supply chain team to be aligned and to be empowered. And this is research that we've been doing. This was 600 respondents. And this research really spoke to me for us to think about talent. And I think the biggest barrier for us to move to Supply Chain 2030 is the gray matter in our heads. We have defined supply chains inside out, not outside in. And in fact, when I do training, I ask people to draw supply chains. And I've done it for 2 years, and the first thing people draw are suppliers, not customers. And as we think about outside-in processes, we must start with the customer, we must define the processes outside in, and build these teams. And this is, I think, really important because the other thing we find is people that have implemented supply chain planning or implemented data analytics don't necessarily use them very well. In fact, we found an inverse correlation between people that believe that their planning systems work and the impact on cost and inventory. And you might say, well, what happened to all that project work that we've done, and where has that led? And I think the issue is really threefold. One, I think we've implemented supply chain planning as a technology project, not really as a way of working. Organizations have become more reactive as they become more global. Two, we've got a lot of technology that was not implemented very well. And most people are operating in Excel ghettos and not really using supply chain planning as it's designed. And three, I think that the culture for planning really requires evolution and the fit of the data models. So as we think about this balance of supply chain, we do the Supply Chains to Admire every year where we look at improvement. So are companies driving improvement on these important metrics? We look at value, or are they driving market capitalization, which I think we need to hold ourselves accountable for? And are we improving performance? And this work that we've done on the Supply Chains to Admire started because I wanted to know in the research which companies are doing the best. And as we've matured this methodology, we found out a couple things. These are the Supply Chains to Admire winners for this year. It's our 4th year of doing it. Cisco Systems is the only company that has been in all 4 years. So Cisco Systems actually redefined their supply chain out of failure. Failure is a tremendous rallying cry for people to really drive supply chains differently. TSMC, which is a semiconductor company, is one of my favorite companies because they've built value networks for content for semiconductor. They're one of the few examples I know of effective value networks. When you look at the slide, you see more discrete companies than you see process companies. And one of the reasons is because the discrete companies are much better at planning and understanding supply chains. They've outsourced to a greater degree, and that's driven them to really manage global supply chains. You don't see any pharmaceutical companies on the list because pharmaceutical companies have really not stepped up to the bar to drive supply chain excellence. You see L'Oreal on the list. L'Oreal is one of the few companies that's been successful in cost to serve. Hershey has been one of the few companies to really manage point-of-sale data effectively. And we also have retailers. So one of the things that we do every year is we give the Supply Chains to Admire awards. And this year, I'm going to call Dollar General to the stage. Tony, if you can come to the stage. Tony, now these are your results. They're pretty impressive results. Let's give Tony a hand. Tony, when you look at your orbit charts and you look at what you've done, what do you think really helped you do that driving of improvement and performance?
Yeah, I think we've been focused a lot on our growth of the company and kind of putting the infrastructure in the supply chain to help support that growth. So there's a big focus in the organization on supporting that growth as we grow our store base, and in turn we grow our distribution network. And so the supply chain is working as one unit to kind of drive and deliver that promise to the customer in our store perspective.
Well, one of the things I love about what you've done is it's a new format, right? You've really gone after the value-conscious consumer. It's a very targeted format, and we see in retailers that when they define new formats, they're able to better win in the market. How would that happen at Dollar General?
Yeah, so if you look at the business model, it's been around for over 75 years. It's been refined over the years, but we've kind of tuned it. And the economy helps us in some cases, and then we also get some trade-off customers coming into us when the economy gets better. So we're well positioned in the market from a retail perspective. We're convenient to the customers. We're low priced on our EDLP model, and we're able to kind of meet that fill-in trip that people are looking for, so they don't have to go to a big box every time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
And Tony's going to be here if you want to talk to him. The second award is for Cummins. Cummins is a multiple-year award winner, and Erica's going to come to the stage. Erica actually presented last year, and when I was an analyst at a different firm, I had no idea that Cummins was doing such great things. So Erica, if you look at your orbit charts,
Sure.
and I know you've done a lot of work on this, what have you learned from this journey, and what do you think really drives this at Cummins?
Sure. So basically that a lot of the transformation initiatives we have going around, they have to be centrally led. They have to have buy-in from the business units. We are a company that is divided in 4 different business units, and it used to be that a lot of the efforts were independently driven, and by looking when the orbit chart started moving in the right direction is when we started centrally led.
Centrally led.
Yeah.
And also, you've done an awful lot of work on product development and the integration of product development into your Cummins processes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So we manage, and I think it was some of the things we mentioned last year, a wide portfolio of products across the world. We generate products specific for certain geographies. We are starting to do research in very innovative, electrified products. There's some press releases out there that you can check out, and yeah, that's where we are.
Okay, we'll give Erica a hand. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the other thing that's happening that's very vogue is this whole concept of digital. In fact, when I ask people to define supply chain, no one in this room defines supply chain the same way. And the concept of digital, which has become very vogue, lacks a definition. So I say to people that when we're going to drive digital transformation, we have to have big feet and big wings. Big wings help us with where we're going. Big feet make sure that we're really well grounded. And what I often see in organizations is that we'll have one or the other. We'll either have wings or we'll have feet, but we're not really able to put the two together. And so what I want you to do as part of this effort of this conference is think about, what does digital mean? Because I don't think it's clear. Digital marketing was pretty easy. And in fact, Robert Gordon tomorrow is going to talk about how the third industrial revolution stopped in 2004, which was mobile phones and looked at computers. But the evolution of B2B and the digital world is evolving. And so I say to people, well, what does digital mean? Is it the autonomous supply chain? Tom Bonkenberg is going to talk about the autonomous supply chain, which is self-driving vehicles and robotics. Is it really looking at Uberization or collaborative platforms? I was in Africa and I had farmers who were doing sharing of farm implements, and they were using a concept called M-Pesa, which is an alternate form of currency. Is it 3D printing, which Mitch Free is going to talk about his new model to print parts at UPS and the evolution of 3D printing, which helps us to be local. Our processes today, as we've become more global, are all about bigger and more efficient processes. Is it the Internet of Things? AGCO is going to talk about, streaming data and wearables, and data can really move at the speed of business, which most of our processes are very batch. Is it the redefinition of B2B? We have a presentation on the network of networks and blockchain and redefinition of supply chain finance. Or is it cloud computing? Is it the federation of data? I don't know what it is for you. But one of the things I do know, for you to make it actionable, you've got to define it. And you've got to have a leader, and you've got to have a tangible goal. And what I find is the companies that do the best in digital transformation have small, scrappy teams. It isn't a large bus of consultants that come to the front door. It's a very targeted group which have the ability and the freedom to really drive innovation and change. We need a culture that we embrace mavericks. We need a culture that really helps us to challenge traditional thinking. On Friday, we're going to play the game that we've built with LlamaSoft, which is about outside-in processes. Now, I've been talking outside-in so long, you're probably tired of it. But people said to me, Lora, you got to define it. And I said, I've got to go beyond defining it. I think you've got to experience it. So in the game that we're going to play, you're going to see that the teams that are outside in short fewer cases, and they have better market capitalization. Well, why is that? Well, it's because we're using channel data and we're using outside-in processes. But today we don't do that. In fact, I was at a consumer products company the other day that had 60% of their processes flowing through vendor-managed inventory, and they didn't use the data. And I was talking to another company that sits on 15 terabytes of point-of-sale data, and I said, why are you not using it in the supply chain? Well, the problem is it doesn't fit in our current applications. Our processes are not designed to be outside in. The data sits at the doorsteps, but we're not using it in traditional processes. So the redefinition for outside in processes requires a different way of thinking. Similarly, as we shift to sensing and outside in, our supply chains have always been about response, not about sensing. And the ability to sense and test and learn is really a great opportunity. I think cross-channel work allows us to do more test and learn. But we cannot define outside-in processes unless we challenge 4 paradigms. The first paradigm is we aren't comfortable unless we put all data in rows and columns, right? We got to stick it in an Excel spreadsheet, or we got to have a relational database. And we're very focused on schema, on write. All of our systems are put in with the assumption of as is, to be conditions, and we define data models when we put in the systems, and it's schema on write. So schema on read allows us to have the data so that it can be assembled on read. This is a very big difference as we look at the applications. The second thing is we have fixed hierarchies. In fact, every time we put in planning, we drive a fixed hierarchy for the implementation. Those fixed hierarchies become barriers because we're not smart enough when we put those systems in to know what those hierarchies need to be. But if those can be rules-based ontologies that can learn and adapt, and we can have multiple ifs to multiple thens, then we solve a lot of problems because the rules in the supply chain were set up for single ifs to single thens. Think about ATP or allocation or inventory matching. Those are all single ifs to single thens, and they don't allow for adaptive behavior. Now, when I was an analyst in 2002, I did a lot of writing about B2B. And there was this predominant view that B2B would be my ERP to your ERP to their ERP. And that just doesn't work very well, right? There's too many issues, and it's about more than transactional data. So when we think about the redefinition of B2B, we need to think about network of networks. We need to think about how we can use blockchain and cognitive computing and Internet of Things and open source technology to really drive this differently. And then we also have to think about what is analytics. Most companies have been very focused on descriptive analytics. So how do I get data together and I have the view of the data? But as we think about the movement from descriptive analytics to predictive analytics allow us to do linear optimization, to prescriptive analytics, which prescriptive analytics allow us to not only get exceptions, but to know what to do with the exceptions, to cognitive, that is a very big difference. In fact, what's going to happen is our current decision support tools will be obsolete in, I think, 5 years. So at the conference, when I sat down and I designed the agenda, which I handpick all of the speakers, there are 5 learning objectives that I have out of the program. The first is outside-in processes. I want us to really embrace our reality today that we're not good at fulfillment. And we're not good at fulfillment because we're not sensing the channel, responding to the channel, and building outside-in processes. We have a lot of channel data. We're not using it. This is recent research. Look at the gaps between use of channel data and replenishment. We're just not using it because we haven't defined outside-in processes. They're new. They're disruptive. Our outside-in channel data doesn't fit in our current processes. So when you play our game, you will have teams of people. Some will be inside out and some will be outside in. The inside out team will do discrete event simulations on orders and shipments. The outside in team will do and play with channel data. And you'll see the impact on the company for market capitalization and fulfillment. It is my hope that this will help people to spark a new conversation to be outside in. Now, the second thing is the autonomous supply chain, which Tom Bonkenberg is going to talk about, is all about how does the supply chain really sense and respond and do that at the speed of business. Today, what's happening is we have a lot of batch processes and we don't move data at the speed of business. Now, not all data needs to fly first class, right? We don't always have to fly first class, and data doesn't have to either. But what happened is we haven't architected to really think about what data needs to be in clouds and what data needs to be in streams and where should data pull. And this architecture of data analytics is something that we'll have to redefine for our supply chains. And also, as we think about analytics, our paradigm is what I call an alphabet soup paradigm. When we think about analytics, we're thinking about analytics that go on top of alphabet soup, ERP, WMS, CRM, SRM. Those traditional technologies made the silos very efficient, but did not make the supply chain very effective. So when we think about analytics, we need to think about the space between our transactional and our decision support systems and also our workforce automation systems, and think about how do we drive this. Now, in preparation for the conference, we ask you to fill out our research surveys about how do you see supply chain 2030 and what excites you. And you can see that as people think about 2030, descriptive analytics is not as important, and you can also see that big data techniques are not as important because there we're dealing with data pooling and data at rest. But what really becomes important is the Internet of Things, cognitive computing, our ability to drive autonomous supply chains, and that's all disruptive. When you talk about autonomous supply chains, cognitive computing, and Internet of Things, you are having the discussion about what do I do, and you're having also the ability to say what I've got today is legacy. What I've got today for decision support, for manufacturing is legacy, and how do I move forward to really rethink this? Now tonight in the digital showcase, there are lots of vendors who will talk cognitive and will talk machine learning, and in fact, it's become kind of vogue like digital supply chain. And I want to give you kind of a roadmap so that when you go up to their tables, you can talk about cognitive. The way I see the evolution of analytics is we start with predictive and descriptive analytics, and that's a lot of what you have today. And prescriptive analytics tells us the exceptions, but also tells us what to do about it. So a good example of prescriptive analytics is Google, which works on maps. So if you have a Google map and you're driving down the road and there's a car in front of you that has an accident, Google Maps tells you not only the exception, but tells you what to do about it. That is prescriptive analytics. We do not have a lot of implementations of prescriptive analytics. And then we get into this area of machine learning and pattern recognition, which I think totally redefines master data management and totally has us rethink what is data and unstructured data. We're not good at the use of unstructured data, warranty data, quality data, social data, because we want to put all our data into rows and columns, and we want to have lots of data that's very structured. And then we get into the area of cognitive computing. Now, cognitive computing allows us to sense, learn, and act. And it's really based upon learning models. So tonight, when people talk about cognitive computing, I want you to ask, how do your systems learn? And at what speed do your systems learn? We have a couple of presentations that will be going through this. One is Dee. Dee's going to be talking about the Unilever case study for cognitive. And Tom's going to be talking about the autonomous supply chain, sense and learn, and some of the work that he's seen in robotics, and also the autonomous supply chain with vehicles. Now the third trend, so the first one was outside in. The second one is analytics and insights. The third is real-time data. And when we think about real-time data, we're redefining time. Time has gotten shorter and shorter in the supply chain. And as we think about redefining time, we've really got to think about digital manufacturing, and we've got to think about supplier sensing, and we've got to think about how do we use this data. And as we think about real-time data, Jabil is going to be giving a case study on their digital manufacturing transformation. As Jabil talks, I want you to listen to the fact that they had big wings and they had big feet. They knew where they were going. And they didn't just use Internet of Things and 3D printing and analytics because they were cool technologies for technologies, but they knew that they needed to redefine contract manufacturing and really drive a difference. Now, manufacturing is at the core of many of our supply chains. And as we think about digital manufacturing, there are many technologies that come together, whether it's additive printing, 3D printing, paperless processes, wearables, or robotics. And I think all of those come together. So the discussions with AGCO on wearables, the discussion with Fast Radius on 3D printing. What I want you to do is really listen to these presentations about how has manufacturing changed. Peggy from AGCO is going to talk about, she had tablets in her manufacturing line and they kept getting broken, and so she went to wearables, and you're going to see some of those glasses tonight where people could see and they didn't have to hold a tablet. John's going to talk about the Jabil transformation. Mitch is going to talk about redefining service parts through additive manufacturing. And Brian from British Telecom is going to talk about demand-driven, right? Still a current topic, outside in, using demand-driven and being very focused on channel data and demand translation. Now, at the end of tomorrow, we're going to talk about the network of networks. One of the issues is we do not have good supply chain visibility globally. Much of our opportunity lies between companies. So as we think about the network of networks, we've got to think about how do we use artificial intelligence and machine learning to really drive this difference, because standards don't just get it, because we have too much mapping. So if we can learn from the data and we can map the data automatically, then we get out of a lot of the master data issues. And unfortunately, the sad world is that we've got a lot of customer data and a lot of supplier data, but it's not used in the supply chain. If we're going to be outside in, we need to talk about who owns data and how we use data in a very different way. And then this network of networks work that we really started, which started 2 years ago, I brought people together, and I brought the smartest business people and the smartest technologists together, and I said, how could we design the network of networks? How could we build interoperability between networks? And of course, first the vendors said, well, we have the network of networks, right? All you need is my system, and you've got the network of networks. We forgot to tell people to put their phones on silent, but that's a good thing to do now. But as we think about the network of networks, no one vendor has the ability to drive interoperability. And the network of networks group that we started happened because I had a large manufacturer say, I've got these systems and they don't talk to each other. And in fact, if you look at supply chain operating networks, we've probably got over 150 canonicals that don't have interoperability. And so they're looking at how do we bring these together? Not in one-to-many, but in many-to-many architectures. And how do we build those canonicals, and could we use blockchain to really drive messages? Now, blockchain is evolving, and I think it's a very promising technology. But one of the things we found is blockchain and security is not that effective today on many-to-many architectures. It's more effective on one-to-many architectures. So as we think about this evolution and many-to-many architectures, and the ability to go across architectures, we've got to embrace new technologies, and we've got to think about what should our processes be. So with blockchain, we can disintermediate banking. There's a reason why the largest building in every city is a bank, right? Finance is the art of money changing hands until there's nothing left, and supply chain is building value, right? So as we think about supply chain finance and we think about blockchain, we've got a great opportunity coupled with cognitive computing. And as we move data across, we've got the ability to connect supply chain operating networks. But we have to define, what do these multi-tier processes look like? We don't know how to share demand data effectively. We don't know how to really build multi-tier visibility. So in the network of networks session, you'll get some feedback from the group on the work we've done on network of networks and driving it. So let's move forward. Let's be action-oriented. Let's test our paradigm. An interesting thing that I found in the research is most companies have gone backwards in their ability to be disruptive in the last decade. In fact, what we find is that there used to be a bell curve of early adopters and late adopters. When I was an analyst in the 1990s and early 2000, when I asked people, are you an early adopter or a late adopter? Because we really got to move with technology at the speed of adoption. We had an equal bell curve. We had an equal number of early adopters and late adopters. But what we have today is only 14% are early adopters. And there's a couple of problems. One is we want to implement new technologies with a fixed ROI. That doesn't happen. Early adopters don't have a fixed ROI, right? We need to be open to the outcome. We can't just have traditional projects. Secondly, as we think about the ability to really think differently, we've got to have the discussion with the finance team, right? We've got to say we've got to self-fund these projects. Maybe we take some of the money that we've got in continuous improvement and we self-fund them. But we need processes for process improvement. We have processes for product improvement, stage gate processes, but we have no processes for process improvement. And so as we think about innovation at the edge and really driving process evolution at the center, we have to have a discussion with the CFO that this is about funding small, scrappy teams to test new technologies where we don't know the outcome. It's about challenging the basic DNA of the supply chain because 90% of companies are stuck. It's about building new business models, right? Our move to globalization has taken us to very efficient supply chains with large batch sizes and long shipping times. Does that have to be? So as we think about this evolution, I think it's time to take a different path. And I'm glad you're here, and I hope you also have the same feeling. So, when we think about automating supply chain 2030, one of the main issues we have is supply chain cycles. Now, on the back of your badge, you have numbers, and the numbers are designed for tables, and the tables are designed for you to have a conversation with the people that I want you to really talk to about topics to build a guiding coalition. My goal is that when people leave, they have built networking opportunities that will carry them to really question this. It's not about single journeys. It's about the ability to build a guiding coalition. And we wouldn't be here without our sponsors. And today at our digital showcase, we're going to have cards, and we want you to go to each of the tables. And if you go to the tables, then you'll be able to really play in the digital showcase and Jeopardy game, because we want you to have fun as well. And also, I want you to really embrace the team that has put this on. The team is bigger now. We are adding new products for benchmarking and training in our game, and we want you to be able to really use the products to imagine supply chain 2030.